That's how, ladies and gentlemen, while we get a live feed here. Wow, guilty. Stand by. We're going to see
this to his a political advantage to the extent he can. And I think the first statement to come from any of his family members since this verdict was issued, I think, is an example of that. That would be Don Jr., who was not here at the courthouse today. He was here yesterday. Eric Trump was inside the courtroom, currently still is. And I just want to read for you Don Jr.'s tweet, if I could. Quote, guilty on all counts. The Democrats have succeeded in their years-long attempt to turn America into a third world expletive. November 5 is our last chance to save it. I read that last line, November 5 is our last chance to save it, because Donald Trump himself on the campaign trail has repeatedly suggested that the end of America is near if they does not take back the White House. From our team of reporters and they say Donald Trump, the defendant, has been seated inside of that courtroom, stoic, stone-faced. He looked at each of the jurors as they walked out, all 12 of those New Yorkers, as they walked out of the courtroom. This is somebody who is still seated in a straightforward position, understanding the political stakes now that he has been found guilty of these 34 felony counts here in New York.
Juan Hilliard, there was a point in the Republican primary where the campaigns of Chris Christie and a couple of others had some polling data that suggested that a conviction would change the dynamic in the Republican primary. Donald Trump seemed to, in his reptilian political survival skill set, I say that as a compliment, actually, understand that and intuit that.
That he's been found guilty on all 34 counts.
You see Emile Beauvais there, Epstein, one of his top advisors.
That's Stephen Chung, whose back is to us. He's a campaign spokesperson. Alina Habba, Trump's other attorney. They're clearly huddling. This is what they did the other day when Trump was about to come address the cameras. They sat outside the courtroom and kind of talked about it.
The prosecutors told the judge that there is no bail. So sentencing will be now in July. Let's see if he's...
Donald Trump and Todd Blatch are talking. That's Jason Miller, who you can see in the back with his glasses on, and Eric Trump is the tall one right there, deciding what he's going to say to the cameras.
You know, it's interesting to hear the rhetoric that Trump has used against Judge Juan Merchan for, I think, anybody witnessing this inside the courtroom. He seemed to bend over backwards to try to be fair to all the parties in this. The Trump team has to file any motions by June 13th, and the prosecution must respond by June 27th.
The judge certainly did everything.
Here's the former president, now a convicted felon 34 times, about to address reporters.
This was a disgrace. This was a rigged trial by a conflicted judge who was corrupt. It's a rigged trial, a disgrace. They wouldn't give us a venue change. We were at 5% or 6% in this district, in this area. This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. The real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people. And they know what happened here, and everybody knows what happened here. You have a Soros-backed DA, and the whole thing. We didn't do a thing wrong. I'm a very innocent man, and it's okay. I'm fighting for our country. I'm fighting for our Constitution. Our whole country is being rigged right now. This was done by the Biden administration in order to wound or hurt an opponent, a political opponent. And I think it's just a disgrace. And we'll keep fighting. We'll fight till the end, and we'll win, because our country's gone to hell. We don't have the same country anymore. We have a divided mess. We're a nation in decline, serious decline. Millions and millions of people pouring into our country right now from prisons and from mental institutions, terrorists, and they're taking over our country. We have a country that's in big trouble. But this was a rigged decision right from day one, with a conflicted judge who should have never been allowed to try this case, never. And we will fight for our Constitution. This is long from over. Thank you very much.
Why should voters vote for a convicted felon?
Are you guys talking about?
Donald Trump not talking details of the case, but attacking, as he has pretty much every day, consistently and often late at night, the judicial system in the United States, claiming that this is rigged, that this shouldn't have been brought in New York, where his business is in fact located. Here with Paula Reed and Caitlin Collins. I mean, this is, again, clearly he's turning this to politics and to the campaign and trying to link this, what he calls a rigged system, to a rigged system that he hopes his voters believe in.
Yeah, he has to now, right? Because he's the Republican nominee, and this is going to be a factor, perhaps not a big one, perhaps not one that'll change the hearts and minds of voters, but this is something he is going to have to contend with. And his framing is, again, that this is all election interference, the same argument the prosecutors made against him, right? He was trying to subvert democracy. That's how he's going to try to frame this to the American public, to explain why he is now a convicted felon.
And what's remarkable is the sentencing for Donald Trump in this case is going to happen. That hearing 4 days before he will attend the Republican National Convention as the party's, he's the presumptive Republican nominee. Now he will become the party's official nominee there. That's also when he's expected to announce who is going to be the vice presidential candidate. And it's remarkable that obviously we've never been at this moment in history, but the fact that he will be at that convention 4 days after he is sentenced in this case, when we find out what the judge here, Judge Juan Merchan, who he's attacked repeatedly as corrupt without any basis for that, it is a remarkable moment. And where this election is headed, we don't know what the political impact of this will be, but the fact that he'll be sentenced as a convicted felon 4 days before the Republican convention is something we've never seen before.
Yeah. Daniel Dale, fact checker for us, is with us. Daniel, you heard what former president said there. What stood out to you?
He made the false claim that he made before the trial, made almost every day during the trial, and repeated again now after the trial. He said that this was all done by the Biden administration. As I've said, I think on TV more than 10 times at this point, there is not a shred of evidence that the Biden administration did anything to bring this case, to orchestrate this case, to run this case. This was a case brought by a locally elected prosecutor, yes, a Democrat, Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg. There is no sign that Joe Biden, his DOJ, his White House had anything to do with it. Former President Trump continues to reference a former DOJ official under President Biden who went to work for DA Bragg's team. There was no sign that anyone else at DOJ or the president himself had anything to do with that personal employment decision. And then off topic, not a focus today, he repeated his claim that people are pouring in over the border from mental institutions. As Caitlin has repeatedly noted, I have specifically asked the Trump campaign for any evidence to corroborate that claim. They have provided zero, nothing at all.
Daniel Dale, thanks so much. You can hear helicopters now circling above the location we are, right outside the courthouse. Obviously, this is something police in New York, Secret Service, and others have certainly been preparing for very carefully. We're going to have continuing coverage throughout the day and throughout the evening. Right now, let's go back to Jake Tapper in Washington. Jake.
Thank you, Anderson. And for those wondering about the political consequences of these 34 guilty verdicts, the short answer is nobody has any idea, period. Nobody has any idea what the effect will be. We do know that there has been polling information about how a guilty verdict might affect individuals, but theoretical is obviously different from actual. There was a new NPR PBS NewsHour Marist poll released recently that suggested that any verdict in the hush money trial would be unlikely to have a major effect on most voters' choice. It wouldn't impact for most people. Overall, 67% of registered voters said a guilty verdict in the trial would not make a difference. 76% said the same thing about a not guilty verdict. Where there is significance is in the margins, because this is, as far as we can tell right now, going to be a very close election in a handful of battleground states, and a few people defecting from Biden or Trump could make the difference between winning the White House and losing the White House. And in the polls, a small share of people who support Trump say that a guilty verdict would dissuade them from supporting Trump. In the Marist poll, 7% of those who say they would vote for Trump in the presidential race say a guilty verdict would make them less likely to back them. In a Quinnipiac poll, 6%. Not a lot. And again, theoretical, this took place before the verdicts, 34 of them. But it is suggestive, Dana Bash, that this could have an impact on some Trump voters.
It could. And I mean, just to sort of reemphasize what you just emphasized
We have no
multiple
idea.
times, we don't know. And it's one thing to sort of say beforehand. And it's another thing, in the words of one of his allies who I talked to while they were up in New York on the air, 34 is a big number. Just not only on his personal impact, but on the political impact. It just, despite the bravado that we just heard from the former president, and we will continue to hear from him and his allies as their statements are pouring in support of him and echoing the witch hunt and the rigged and all the things that he claims, which Daniel Dale
right, and we should note
the
Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, Republican Speaker of the House, called today a shameful day in American history. Democrats cheered as they convicted the leader of the opposing party on ridiculous charges predicated on the testimony of disbarred convicted felon. He goes on from there. But the point I think you're making is we're going to have, in addition to the momentousness of these 34 counts, we're going to have months of that kind of rhetoric from very powerful Republican officials throughout the country. Let's go to Kara Scannell right now, who just came from inside the courtroom of this incredibly historic day. Kara?
Hey, Jake. Yeah. So, we thought that this was ending at the end of the day without a verdict. And then the judge came back on the bench after saying he was going to excuse the jury. He returned at 4:36 saying the jury had another note. It was time-stamped at 4:20. They had a verdict and they needed an extra 30 minutes. The mood changed entirely inside the courtroom. Trump had been laughing with his lawyer, Todd Blatch. They'd been talking a lot. He was smiling. It appeared they thought that this day was ending without a verdict. And then after the judge had read the note, everything changed. He became very still. He had his arms folded across his chest. It became a much different situation inside that courtroom. And then we waited for the jury to enter. When they came in, they filed into the courtroom. None of them looked over at Donald Trump. That is normal. They normally don't. But they all walked toward their seats, took their seats, and then the court security officer asked them to read the verdict. So the foreman stood up with a microphone, and he was asked for each count if they had reached a verdict and what it was. And he went through all 34 counts saying guilty. Then after that, the court security officer asked them if this was a unanimous verdict by all the jurors. They answered audibly in the courtroom saying that yes, it was. The judge asked if any of the parties wanted this individually polled. Todd Blatch, Trump's lawyer, said he did want the jurors individually polled. So they went through each juror, each of the 12 jurors, one by one, and they each confirmed that their verdict on all 34 counts was guilty. Then the judge had thanked the jury for their service. He excused them and said that he wanted to talk to them afterwards, asking them to stick around for a little bit because he wanted to thank them individually for their service over these past 7 weeks of this trial since jury selection began. So they were waiting in the back room for the judge to go and discuss with them. And then the judge sent the sentencing date for July 11th. And then at that point, he said if there was nothing else, he was going to excuse them. At this point, Donald Trump stands up. We can now finally get a good look at his face. His face was red. He looked upset. He had a frown on his face. And as he walked toward the well that separates where he's sitting into the common area, the galley where the rest of us are, his son Eric Trump was sitting in that first seat. And so Donald Trump reached out to him, shook his hand vigorously, and then as he was walking past him, Eric Trump patted his father on the back. So kind of the most humane moment we've seen in this trial, this personal, emotional interaction between the father and son as Trump then walked down the center aisle of the courtroom and out into the hallway where then he spoke to the cameras. So, it's certainly a historic moment and quite a dramatic moment coming very unexpected at the end of this day, which had looked like it was heading toward there not being a verdict. So certainly a surprise to Donald Trump and his team, and something that they did not see coming based on the change in their demeanor. And it's certainly a serious moment for Trump where he did look like he was upset with the outcome of this trial.
And Kara, tell us, if you would, about the jurors, these 12 Americans, 12 Manhattanites, in addition to the 6 alternates who were asked to consider, give up their lives for several weeks, consider a very complicated case and charges, came back fairly quickly with this unanimous guilt verdict of 34 guilty charges, making for the first time in the history of the United States a former president of the United States a convicted felon. When they were sitting there as the foreperson read the verdict, when they were being polled, each one of them, all 12, saying that they agreed with the guilty verdict on all 34 counts, did they look at the defendant, the former president? Did they have any emotions on their face? You said earlier that the president was looking at them. What were they doing with their faces?
When the foreperson was reading the verdict, the jurors, I'd say half of them were looking straight down at the ground and others were looking at the judge. I didn't see any of them look at Donald Trump. And, as you noted, he had craned his neck so he could look at them as they were being individually polled. None of them appeared to make any eye contact with him while they were sitting in the box throughout this whole reading of the verdict, both when the foreperson read it, when they were individually polled, and then when they left. So they did not appear to look at him at any time entering or leaving the courtroom. And as he was watching them today, none of them appeared to look back at him. And this jury is all made up of New Yorkers, but the foreperson is from Ireland, an immigrant here. There's a well-educated jury. There were a couple of lawyers on the jury, some other executives. So it's representative of New York in many ways, and a jury of Trump's peers, as he is a native New Yorker himself. But there's appeared to be no emotion either displayed on the faces of the jurors. They were all pretty straight-faced, no expression throughout this whole process. And it is something that, they knew coming into this, that this was going to be a significant historical trial. And throughout the trial, none of them had betrayed any sense of what they thought of the evidence or how they were reacting to any of the witnesses. They really kept straight faces. I've often joked they've had poker faces on this whole time. You really were not getting any revelations from them throughout this trial, Jake.
Very wise. What about the judge, Juan Merchan, who has been attacked over and over by the defendant, former President Trump, now a convicted felon, by his allies in the media? What was his reaction? And also, if you saw any reaction of the defense attorneys or the prosecution what they did during this rather surreal moment in American history?
You know, the judge had brought the jurors in. He's a soft-spoken man, and he was even soft-spoken when he came in and had said to them, you know, initially he came in and said, I'm going to excuse the jury at 4:30 today. I'll be right back. And he left the bench. There's about 15 minutes left in the day. He came back in at 4:36 and he said, I have a note. There is a verdict. But he has maintained this kind of cool composure the entire time. Then when he brought the jurors in, and while we're waiting in this period for the jury to come in, it is almost pin silent in that courtroom. Everyone being on edge, everyone waiting for the door to the right of the judge to open and for those jurors to walk in. There was no discussion amongst the parties as we were waiting in this moment. Then when the jury came in, you know, the judge essentially hands it over to the court officer. He asked them initially at first, you know, I have your note. Is this accurate? Is this your note that you have a verdict? The foreman confirms. And then the judge hands it off to one of the court officers who does the individual verdict reading, asking the foreperson each time for count one, how do you find? And then he'd say guilty across all 34 of those counts. It was only after all of that was completed, the judge then thanked the jurors for their service, said he wanted to talk to them, said he couldn't talk about the case, couldn't talk about the facts, but he just wanted to talk to them because he knew that they had sacrificed a lot to be members of this jury hearing evidence for the past 6 weeks in what is undoubtedly a very high profile case. And these jurors know they know where they are. They know the attention on this. As you'll remember from jury selection, there was a lot of attention on whether jurors felt that they were being too exposed by the idea that people knew that they were here for jury duty. So he wanted to take the jury back and to meet with them. Now, this jury has been essentially anonymous. Only the lawyers have known their names. Even the foreperson signing the verdict sheet was just supposed to sign with his juror number. And that was, the judge had done that out of protection for this jury. So we do not know if any of them are going to speak. The judge told them that all of the restrictions he has placed on them have been lifted, that they are able to speak if they want to, but he also told them that they don't have to speak if they don't want to. Now, also, I would say the prosecution, as is pretty typical, they kept straight faces throughout the reading of the verdict, and they left the room without saying anything or showing any emotion, Jake.
All right. Thank you so much, Kara Scannell. Unbelievable day in that rather shabby courtroom in the New York City courthouse. The White House has generally been avoiding commenting on this case, but that has seemed to change in the last few days. The Biden-Harris campaign sent Robert De Niro and 2 of the police officers who were attacked on January 6th to Manhattan to talk about the case. And let's go to Kayla Tausche, who is outside the White House on the North Lawn right now, because we are now getting our first reaction, if not from the White House itself, from the Biden-Harris campaign. What do they have to say, Kayla?
Well, Jake, the statement is from Communications Director Michael Tyler, and it says in part, in New York today, we saw that no one is above the law. Donald Trump has always mistakenly believed he would never face consequences for breaking the law on his own personal gain. But today's verdict does not change the fact that the American people face a simple reality. There is still only one way to keep Donald Trump out of the Oval Office: at the ballot box. Convicted felon or not, Trump will be the Republican nominee for president. The statement goes on to allude to the chaos that the campaign believes would ensue if Trump were reelected, saying the American people will reject it this November. Of course, we just heard the former president say that the people will be the final deciders here and that November 5th will be when this case ends. And it is, in his words, long from over. Now, it's unclear exactly when or even whether we would hear from President Biden responding directly to the fact that his predecessor is found guilty on 34 felony counts. Throughout the week, aides were non-committal about whether the president would weigh in personally, alluding to a very complicated schedule that he has, as well as the fact that today, in particular, is a somber day for the Biden family. They are in Delaware, where they're remembering Beau Biden, the president's son, who died 9 years ago today at age 46. It's a day that the family usually spends out of the public eye. And to that end, the White House called a lid at 9:53 a.m. earlier today. That means that we were not expecting to see the president in public again. Of course, history could change things. Jake?
All right, Kayla Tausche, thank you so much. And let us consider this moment, a rather significant one in American history. For the first time ever, a former U.S. president is now a convicted felon, found guilty by a jury of his peers of 34 felony counts of falsifying business records. Some questions that some of you might have: can a convicted felon run for president? The answer is yes. Can a convicted felon serve as president? The answer is yes. Can a convicted felon vote for himself or herself for president? The answer is it depends on the state, but in Florida, where Donald Trump lives, former President Trump lives, they tend to defer to the state where the conviction takes place, and that is New York, and felons are able to vote in New York if they are out of prison. So those are some of the questions. Now I have questions, and Karen, let me start with you, which is, what exactly is going on in that courthouse right now? We know sentencing is going to be July 11th, which just happens to be within a week of the beginning of the Republican National Convention, for those keeping tabs on the overlap of this case and the political realities in which we live. What are they doing right now? Are the jurors getting out of Dodge? I saw something on the screen saying something about no bail, and I know that just meant like they weren't even thinking about requiring the president to need to put a bail or anything like that. He is a free man, of course. But tell us about what's going on behind the scenes.
So there's a couple things going on behind the scenes right now. First of all, security. There's a whole security protocol that is making sure that everybody, including Trump supporters, are behaving, and including people who wanted the former president convicted, that there is going to be calm and that everybody is okay. So that's going on. The jurors are also being protected, and their anonymity is being protected. So they're going to continue to be driven back home, taken back to the place that they essentially came from, so that they can remain anonymous as long as they choose to. One more thing just to also keep in mind, the gag order is still in effect, which I thought was really interesting that Todd Blatch didn't request Judge Merchan, now that the trial's over, now that the jury is excused, that the gag order be lifted, which means...
And just to remind people, sorry to interrupt, but the judge issued a gag order saying that Donald Trump could not talk publicly about the jurors or the witnesses or members of the family of the judge or the prosecution team, but the judge and the prosecution team themselves were completely fair game rhetorically. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
And then in the DA's office, I just saw they're about to hold a press conference at 6:30. I think Alvin Bragg's going to speak. So they're preparing what they're going to say and how they're going to address this. And they are going to, I guess, tell everybody what this means on behalf of the Manhattan DA's office. So I think everybody is doing their various jobs right now and collecting themselves, because this is such a big deal. And I also think the DA's office is going to start thinking about sentencing.
Yeah,
and
let's
something
talk.
We should think about.
And let's talk about that now with this side of the table, because I believe that the judge gets to decide the sentencing, not the jury. Is that standard? Is that how it always? Sometimes the jury never decides.
In an instance like this, no, that's not going to happen. And we know that, in fact, remember what happened during the closing arguments when Todd Blatch made the reference to prison. The judge was quite clear, and even giving a curative instruction to the jury to say, your job is a fact finder, my job is to actually sentence. And the sentence itself could be a maximum for all charges of 20 years, up to 4 for each count, but the maximum of 20 years. This is a first-time nonviolent criminal offender, though. And so the likelihood of him serving hard prison time is pretty slim, but it does not remove the stain of now being a 34-time felon. And to your point about being a felon and being from Florida, there is a great irony in this instance that he would, if he were in Florida, be asking people to vote for him, and he could not do that. And because this is a crime involving dishonesty and fraud, it's considered under the umbrella of moral turpitude, which means that even after you complete your entire sentence, you'd still have to appeal to the governor of that state.
If he had been convicted in Florida.
If he had been in Florida. And so this irony of Governor Tennessee having to weigh in prospectively.
So let me ask Ellie, how does this work, the sentencing? Because first of all, obviously, Donald Trump, former President Trump, and his legal team are going to appeal. And we've discussed already the grounds for appeal and the arguments that he might bring up for appeal, and there are many. Beyond that, though, he can't appeal until the sentencing, right? And how is that decision made? Does Judge Merchan just go to his chambers and emerge like Moses with tablets? Or are there arguments that are going to be made by Donald Trump's attorneys, by the prosecutors?
There will be intensive investigation and arguments between now and
Public,
July 11th.
public one.
Yeah, we will get public filings where the DA will ask the judge to impose whatever sentence they think is appropriate. Donald Trump's team will put in their request, certainly for a non-incarceratory, a non-prison sentence. And let me address the question that I imagine is on a lot of people's minds, which is how likely is it that Judge Merchan imposes a sentence of prison? Now, this is a Class E felony. In New York State, you have Class A is the most serious felony. Class E is the least serious
Just
felony.
to interrupt it for 1 second, we see the former president there and his team getting into their motorcade of SUVs to return to his home on this unbelievably historic day. No doubt he is angry. No doubt he is sad to a degree, dejected. Karis Cannell talked about a moment where he reached over and shook his son's hand. His son patted him on the back. Whether you think this was the right verdict or not, it is one that weighs heavily on any defendant's emotions. And this is a former president of the United States. I'm sorry, Ali, go ahead.
If we look at the universe of Class E convictions in New York State, and several good researchers out there have done sort of surveys over the last year or so, generally the estimates are that somewhere between 70 and 90% of Class E New York convictions result in non-prison sentences. So that would be some combination of probation, fines, perhaps community service. But the converse of that, 10 to 30-ish% do result in prison time. And this will be entirely up to Judge Merchan.
Is there a difference? Are the 10 to 30% that are sentenced to prison for Class E felonies individuals with worse lawyers? Are there individuals with previous criminal records, like Dana said? I mean, is there any sort of delineation?
So I'll give you what the relevant factors usually would be in a case like this. First of all, how big was the offense? How major was the offense? It's a big difference to steal $5 million versus $100,000. Was this person a first-time offender, or are they on their second, third, fourth conviction? Yeah, the quality of lawyering can absolutely play into it, but this is the most difficult thing that judges do. I mean, you talk to any judge, they will tell you the hardest part of their job is imposing a sentence. And one other thing I just want to make very clear. If Donald Trump does get a prison sentence imposed on him on July 11th, odds are very, very high he will not have to start serving that sentence right away, because in a case like this, he's very likely to get what we call bail pending appeal, meaning he will almost certainly not have to begin serving any sentence until after all of his appeals are done. That would certainly take us out past the election.
So in November, he could be out on bail?
Yes, he will, in all likelihood, in November he will have been sentenced in July, and the sentence will not actually be imposed until his appeals are done, which will take us well into 2025.
So the appeal process, just to be clear here, so the appeal process, which will kick in the very moment after sentencing, right? I mean, the Trump legal team already has those briefs ready to go. They're going to appeal every single one, every single avenue they can, all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, I would imagine. That will take months and months, if not years.
Potentially. So Donald Trump has one appeal as of right to the mid-level New York court, the Court of Appeals for New York, which is the middle level. If he loses there, he can ask the top court in the state of New York, which is actually called the Court of Appeals. The nomenclature gets confusing. He can ask them to take the case. They don't have to, though. It's the same as our U.S. Supreme Court. They can take it if they want to. They don't have to. And then from there, he can try to get it up.
We're watching, by the way, just the motorcade of the former president leaving the courthouse on its way to Trump Tower. Several cars. You see supporters of the former president with Trump flags in the street. And it is an area where there is a lot of security. So there does not appear to be a huge crowd for blocks and blocks and blocks. It's also a a capital D Democratic city by and large. Anderson?
Jake, thanks very much. One side of the street, you see some Trump flags. The other, I saw a couple of one-finger salutes there as well. But the former president now making his way back, assumed, to Trump Tower.
Yeah, it's remarkable. I mean, this is typical a drive he's obviously been making every day after he's left court. You saw him getting in the motorcade The last person I saw Trump speak.
A lot of cheers, a lot of boos. It all came very quickly as the 34 counts were coming in, as long as it took to read that. But right now, it is remarkably peaceful. There's obviously swarming with law enforcement that have been gearing up for this moment, not predicting that he would be found guilty, but prepared for whatever may come, whatever the security risk is. These are law enforcement professionals that have trained for high-profile cases before, but obviously this is different. The stakes are higher. It is politically tinged. It has been sort of a tinderbox in this First Amendment area outside of court, where just weeks ago a man set himself on fire mere steps away from the courthouse. So law enforcement has been ready for this moment, prepared for this moment, whatever the verdict might be. And we continue to watch now the former president of the United States, now convicted of those 34 felonies, working his way through the city now, a different status, not politically perhaps, as you guys have been discussing for the past half an hour, but certainly legally. He is different, in a different category today, now having been convicted of these crimes.
All right, let me turn back to Kristen, if I can, to talk about the impact of this. We've already heard from some of the supporters of the former president. They believe this was a political process. So clearly there is a suspicious glare glancing toward the court. But what about, or toward the prosecution, but what about the court itself? Has it suffered?
I hope not. I think absolutely, listen, the narrative that a lot of the Trump supporters are going to have is going to be maintained. They're going to say this was politically motivated. It was a witch hunt on the side of the prosecution. But we've already heard some negative comments regarding George Mershon and specifically his daughter and her affiliations with the Democratic Party, whether true or not, and how it impacted the case. And so absolutely, they're going to look at the court system. And of course, they're going to look at the jurors as well. Trump has made some statements about the jurors early on, before the trial started. So I absolutely think so. But at the end of the day, you know, I think one of the things that's really important here is Trump's attorneys had the opportunity to select the jury. That was part of the judicial system. And that is exactly what played out here. Trump had certain constitutional rights that were abided by and respected. And that's exactly what we saw in this trial. And at the end of the day, I think all of this could objectively agree that Judge Mershon acted appropriately, fairly, and he conscientiously made sure that he applied the law as it was intended to be applied, as precedent had dictated it should be applied.
It's interesting because in that very brief statement we heard from the former president, he took on the issue of venue, saying that this trial should have never been conducted in New York City, in Manhattan, which is a bastion of you know, liberal politics, that most of the jurors would not be Trump supporters was his assumption. And he's still banging on that drum. And in, speaking of, I think he just posted to Truth Social.
He did. It is really reflective of what he said that we showed live outside of court, that this was a disgrace, he said. He continues to reiterate that he believes this is a rigged trial by a conflicted judge, et cetera. He says, we will fight for our Constitution. This is long from over, in his words. Again, an allusion to November. On this, go ahead.
No,
I was on the venue point. I think it's an interesting one because this is an issue that first thing he said when he came out of court, and I'll tell you, there was a lot on the bingo card of what he could have reacted to, what he could have said when he came out of court, and that's what he chose. It is worth noting here that his defense team only challenged one juror out of the 12. That challenge was obviously denied by Judge Mershon here, but it was, as we saw, an intensive and exhaustive voir dire process, too, for jury selection as well. Of course, Manhattan, obviously New York, does lean Democratic. That is the case. That is true.
And if he had gotten a change of venue, it would have still been in the state of New York, because it's a state case. You don't move it to another state.
Danny, how long before typically would an appeal process take for a case like this?
It could take years. I mean, most appeals take it takes several months to even get a briefing schedule. They have to file their notice of appeal relatively quickly. They get an appeal as of right to the appellate division.
You say they have to file it right away on the specifics of what they're challenging, or just that they're going to challenge?
Just a general notice of appeal, and that starts the appellate process. Then it's going to be in the appellate division first department, because that is the intermediate appellate court here that serves this county and close by counties. It goes up to the appellate division. division, and that takes months, sometimes years. It really depends on the congestion in the court. Arguably, in a case like this, maybe it gets a little closer look, maybe it moves along a little faster, but no, we're months, many months, if not years away from a decision.
But during that time, you would be either serving a sentence or some kind of a sentence.
Yes. General rule is this: if you are serving a very short sentence and you have a major issue on appeal that has a likelihood that you can show is going to result in some overturning of your conviction, then you can suspend not suspend it. You can ask the court to hold it while you appeal. That is not the norm. That's the exception to the rule. But obviously, if it's a sentence of probation, that doesn't happen. If it's a very short sentence and you have those constitutional issues, you can get them to hold off on your sentence. But typically, if it's a lengthy sentence and it doesn't involve any novel issues, then you're going to serve that sentence. Otherwise, everybody would try to prolong their sentence while they were on appeal, and nobody would actually be in prison.
We're watching the Trump motorcade as it presumably heads uptown to Trump Tower moments after, if you're just tuning in, the former president was found guilty. A sweeping verdict from a jury here in Manhattan, 34 counts of falsification of business records, a felony because the jury found it was in pursuit of promoting an election by unlawful means. And those unlawful means, Danny, are likely the fertilest ground for this appeal, because, as we've explained this morning, the jury had to find that there was this unlawful means, but they didn't have to agree on what exactly it was that the former president did wrong. So how do you mount an appeal on that when they were given an assortment of laws that they could have said that there were violations of, but we don't know which ones they relied on? It's not in the court record. It wasn't on the verdict form.
I expect to challenge that the statute is what's called unconstitutionally vague. Now, it's presumed that we all know the law. It's a legal fiction, but the key is the law must prescribe certain conduct. It must say, thou shalt not do something in a way that members of the public can understand, whether or not they've actually read them, because it's presumed that we've all read the law, which obviously we haven't. But it has to be able to tell us with some certainty what is prohibited and what is permitted. And the argument I believe we'll see on appeal is that this statute is unconstitutionally vague because it does not tell us specifically, what does not tell a defendant like Trump or any defendant what exactly was prohibited. And then also, it may create a burden of proof issue, the statute itself. Again, nothing to do with Justice Merchan, but the actual statute as written may create due process issues, burden of proof issues. All of those are fertile grounds for appeal. And then if you go back to the facts, I guess I would put as number 2, maybe elements of testimony of Stormy Daniels, which at the time Justice Merchan himself said raised some concerns. In fact, the real problem was the defense didn't appear to object when Justice Merchan, it seems, thought they should have.
We're looking at the motorcade right now, and you'll note they've hit some traffic. Unlike a presidential motorcade, which could be 20 or 30 vehicles, this is very short for a former president, and dealing with traffic now. Appear to be in the FDR. Makes me wonder if they're going straight to LaGuardia.
Could well be. He may want to get out of town, and he's certainly able to do that as he remains out on bond on his own recognizance. On that appeal issue, Lindsey Graham, who's of course the senator, a Trump ally, and an attorney himself, says he believes this will be reversed on appeal. But just to be clear about that, even if it were, if you win your appeal, you just get another trial. That's if the prosecutors choose to refile charges.
Yes, if your conviction is vacated and the case is remanded back for trial, then yes, a new trial is the next step. But sometimes appellate courts will reverse a conviction and then set the person free. It really depends on what is appealed and what the standard of review is for each ground for appeal.
All right, we want to look what's happening behind the scenes at the courthouse itself. Dasha Burns has been there. Dasha, you were with us as people were crowding in on word that there had been a decision. What's it like now?
Well, Lester, members of the public have been filtering in and out of this park over the last hour or so. People really on all sides of this issue, members of the media as well. We've seen, I think, in fact, over here, some of the folks that are on different sides of this, a supporter of the former president and someone who did believe that she should be found guilty in this case. They've gotten into some clashes, but nothing outrageous. There are police officers here. Some people certainly getting passionate, though, because this is obviously a historic moment. I've been talking to some of the supporters of the former president who really have echoed what we've heard from Hallie and from some of the folks in the studio, that they feel like this is only going to solidify and harden and amplify the support for the former president because they've been listening to what he's been putting out there, what his team has been putting out there. It is a pretty calm scene. I'll tell you, we did hear those cheers and those boos when we first heard the verdict, but otherwise people have been here. They've been discussing this really important moment, a few arguments, some debates, but mostly everyone is just taking in what we have just seen, what we've just experienced, and asking a lot of questions about what exactly is next here. There are more folks having sort of a debate here. This is the First Amendment rights that people are demonstrating right now. They are allowed to be here. They're allowed to make their voices heard. And again, people on all sides of this issue. We've met folks from Long Island, from New Jersey, from the Bronx, from all across the tri-state area that came here to witness all of this, Lester.
And one of the names that has loomed so large in this trial, and Michael Cohen.
Yeah.
We haven't talked about him much here this afternoon. Are we hearing from him?
We are, just in the last few minutes here. He, of course, was the prosecution's star witness, somebody who, of course, has lied and has acknowledged lying. The defense, boy, did they target him repeatedly throughout this trial, including in closing arguments, essentially saying to the jury, how can you believe anything that Michael Cohen says? This guy just doesn't tell the truth. Cohen now says today is an important day for accountability and the rule of law. He says, well, it's been a difficult journey for me and my family. The truth always matters. He goes on to thank his attorneys for their advice and support. One of the things the prosecutors tried to do in their questioning of Michael Cohen was try to draw out, it seemed, try to elicit some empathy from the jurors to what Cohen has gone through. He talked a bit about how this process, testifying against the guy who used to be his boss, somebody who he says he was incredibly close to, was his so-called fixer for many years, how this has been incredibly difficult on his family, on him, on his personal life.
They justified some of his anger.
Yeah, they tried to sort of make that case to the jury. The defense obviously tried to poke holes in it, but it is notable that we're hearing from Cohen tonight.
To say he was a fraught witness is an understatement
100%.
because he had lied, admittedly, repeatedly to Congress, to federal court, to prosecutors, to his family, to Donald Trump. He was caught on the stand acknowledging that he had stolen from his former boss. So the prosecutors were trying to rehabilitate him and say, well, yes, he was a liar, but it was always in service of Donald Trump. And now he's here to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Very interesting. By their verdict, Danny, the jury says, we believe you, Michael Cohen.
Yes, and let's take a step back. Yes, Michael Cohen had credibility issues, but prosecutors often use cooperating witnesses, and Michael Cohen was a cooperating type witness, who have much worse credibility issues. Some of these cooperating witnesses are killers. They're people who deal in guns, in drugs. They have lengthy criminal histories, much longer than Michael Cohen. So the reason that prosecutors use people like Michael Cohen, cooperating witness types, is because they work. They are devastatingly effective. I can tell you from having gone up against them myself. And you can point out that they are liars over and over again. But on the whole, a jury is willing to accept someone's faults, someone who comes in and testifies. And the prosecution will usually own it, just as they did in this case. Not only did they own it, they had no problem throughout their case in chief with Michael Cohen being hit with credibility shrapnel throughout. He was painted by their own witnesses as a sometimes tragic, sometimes bumbling figure, but they always owned that he had credibility issues, and they had to do that.
Yeah, and the prosecutors would say, we didn't choose Michael Cohen. We didn't go to the witness store and pick him up for a low, low price. It's Donald Trump who chose Michael Cohen as his lawyer and fixer, and that is his relevance to the case. We have Jen Psaki with us now, of course, former press secretary at the White House for President Biden. So we've talked a lot about what the potential political ramifications are of a conviction. And we are in uncharted territory. So I think, honestly, some humility here, because nobody knows. We've never had a convicted felon as a former president or as a candidate for federal office. But how do you believe the Biden administration, the Biden campaign will be handling this, and how do you think they should?
Well, you can already see from the last hour or so how they're starting to handle it. And one is the White House had a very short, minimal statement statement that basically referred to believing in the rule of law. The campaign had a much longer statement. One of the key lines in that campaign statement was about how the only way to ensure Donald Trump is not in the Oval Office is the ballot box, which what that tells you is that they are not relying on this conviction, Trump going to jail or whatever the sentencing will be, which we won't know for some time either, as the way to get rid of Donald Trump, to prevent him from being in the Oval Office. I think the challenge if you're in the White House right now is a couple things. You want to try to control the White House team and staff and people who work there to prevent people from celebrating. This is not a time to celebrate. As you said, this is a very serious moment. This is a jury of the former president's peers who just convicted him of crimes on 34 counts. I mean, this is a serious moment. No cheering, no celebrating. Treat it with the seriousness that it warrants. On the campaign, they also have to manage that. What's tricky is they're going to fundraise off of this.
They already are.
They already are. So they're going to fundraise off of it, but I think it's going to be a balance for them. They're not betting on this as being a factor because, as you said, we don't know. We don't know. We see what polls have said, but polls have even said it's a minimal, it's a very small number of Republicans this could move. But my bet is they're not betting on this. They're betting on the ability to turn the conversation to other things which they want to do.
Well, it's good for the goose and it's good for the gander. The Biden campaign's fundraising off it. So is Donald Trump. He's got a post out where he has his image and it says political prisoner.
That's right. It's at least I believe the Democratic campaign arm fundraising off of this at this point.
I think the campaign probably will too. I think we should expect that. And to your point, Trump will as well. Everybody will raise money. That says something about the political system we're in right now, no question.
Well, another point of agreement, which Hallie pointed out, is that both candidates here, Biden and Trump, agreed that this gets settled on November 5th, not in any court of law, but at the ballot box by the voters who are watching right now.
Yes, I was just going to say that was the point in the Biden team's statement that actually stuck out to me, right? It is not suggesting it's over. It's saying this is at the ballot box, people. Stay focused. We have a debate coming up. This is not going to change. Don't become complacent in this moment.
And that's exactly what Donald Trump said. The verdict will come on November 5th.
In some ways, it's kind of I don't want to overstate it and say it's a starting gun, but it is certainly a pivot point. We don't know how it's going to pivot, but it is in some ways a reset for these campaigns as they now have this chapter behind them, this hush money trial behind them, and they move forward. To the point that you two are making, we know what the big issues are going to be for this election. At least we know what they are right now. The economy and immigration. The polling has been very consistent on that. Legal issues, so much as they may move a small slice of perhaps independent voters, does not rate, at least not right now, as one of the biggest issues for voters when they're thinking about going to the ballot box come November. The other piece of this, and Savannah, I think it's so important that you talk about a little bit of humility on the part of political pundits, reporters, analysts. We do not know how the polling will shake out or how people will feel now that Donald Trump has been convicted on all these counts. But here is something we do know, that the Republican Party is rallying around him, even in just the last 90 minutes. We have seen an avalanche of statements coming out from Republican lawmakers, from allies of the former president. Interestingly, from people on that Veep stakes list who are immediately.
All right, ladies and gentlemen. Let's see what is happening. He's been convicted of 34 counts, all 34 counts at the New York State courtroom in Manhattan, New York. Donald Trump is convicted. He will appeal. There's no bail, so he's able to go home and all that. Put your comments down below. Share this with somebody right now. Thank you all for listening to us. You listen to The Real Talk with the RND with Pastor Robert. I'm Pastor Robert here. We'll be back with you a little bit later on this week, and we will be sharing with this and a whole lot of stories. You can go to our Facebook group, Real Talk with the RND with Pastor Robert, so you can get the stories ahead of time, and also you can sign up to get the updates on what's going on. Go to 813, just type subscribe, text subscribe to 813-285-4974. Type subscribe, text subscribe to 813-285-4974. You get the text ahead of time, let know we're about to go on live. This is Real Talk with the RD. I'm Pastor Robert. History has been made today. Lock it in. Peace. I'm still on there.
coveted by campaigns. And how you speak to them and how you talk to them matters. The issues they face every single day, as I was trying to get to in the previous segment, is what I think they will actually ultimately end up voting on, because those are the issues that really impact their daily lives, their children, their own futures, their houses, their car payments, their rent payments. So this is a huge day in politics. Make no mistake about that. And we're going to be talking about it for quite some time, up to and including when the sentencing happens. But the American people are largely going to tune this out and probably have up until this point. They'll pay attention today, maybe tomorrow.